Hello. Welcome to the continuation of our reading, The King and the Corpse. Today we're moving on to our second little story. You remember that, in sequence, we have a pagan hero and a Christian saint. Today we will only talk about the first episode, the pagan hero. Next week we will continue. We've been giving slightly shorter talks about this, so that you have time to reflect a little more on each story, and not combine 2 or 3, which makes it more complex, with a larger amount of information. I hope you are enjoying this format. Today, then, we will tell the story, which is very well narrated by our author. Remember that we are talking about HEINRICH ZIMMER, who works with the idea of the symbolic interpretation of traditional tales. And this book is nothing more than that. A collection of stories that show how humans deal with the dark side of themselves. That is, how to psychologically handle evil, how to integrate it, and know how to react to it. The story we are going to see today is very special in this sense. It's a story of Irish origin. He tells us about a certain king and 2 mythical kings who married and were especially virtuous. So, it was King Con and Queen Ida. They had a kind of truly sacred marriage, where their virtues significantly enhanced each other's abilities, indeed meaning they were greater together than they would be apart. It's the typical case of soulmates. Zimmer says that with them, it's as if they have constituted the Tao, the union, harmony through opposition. And, consequently, they can now shape the T, which is the shadow of this Tao in the world. It is the path and its shadow, the path and its fulfillment. So they achieved this realization in their kingdom as an excellent government, extremely prosperous, to the point that even nature echoed the justice of their rulers. Everything was prosperous, everything responded well. One fine day, they had a son, a handsome prince, whom they decided to name after both parents. Foreseen by an augur, he would be a very wise man, very good. He'd be a great ruler. So, in light of this augury, they decide to name their son after both the father and the mother, Con Ida. And this Con Ida grows up to become a truly virtuous boy, as everyone predicted. It happens that, on a certain occasion, his mother, his kind and wise mother, passes away. And he, now motherless, after some time, out of necessity, his father ends up taking a new queen. Then comes the old story of the stepmother, which, if we were to analyze, is nothing more than the other side of the mother. We have the mother with the nurturing face, full of affection, but she is also a benefactor who educates, who pushes the child towards necessary challenges. The bird is good when it hatches its nest, when it feeds its chicks. But it is also good when it pushes them out of the nest so they learn to fly. So the role of the stepmother comes in, which is other aspect of the mother. This stepmother, as in every good little story, didn't like the boy. She was afraid because she already had children from a previous marriage and feared that he would inherit the throne. She intended this for her own children. And then she devises all sorts of schemes to try to tarnish the boy's reputation, which was necessary for him to become a king. And he, very pure and very kind, he doesn't notice anything, nothing affects him. One fine day, she approaches a witch and goes through a whole series of tasks to acquire a chessboard. This chessboard, magical, allowed its owner, when playing against anyone, to be victorious in the first game. She then invites her stepson, already with the intention of, upon defeating him, demanding that he undertake 3 magical quests for her. 3 magical objects, which were 3 golden apples, a black horse, and a very special dog, which were all owned by the king of the fairy kingdom. It was practically an impossible goal, and she hoped he would perish in the pursuit of this objective. And she invites the boy, now evidently a young man, to play. In the first game, he is defeated. And then she herself gets excited with such a quick victory. She asks him to play another game. And in this second game, evidently, she is defeated. And she decides to stop playing, of course, and she demands from him, then, after the first game, that he seek the three attributes, the three quests. And he, finding himself cornered by this, only then realizing the wickedness of his stepmother, because the goal set was impossible. He tells her that, in return, since he won the second game, she would have to remain isolated at the top of a tower where she would wait, exposed to the sun, exposed to the wind, waiting for him to return, fed in a very frugal manner, and only descending from there when he came back. And so it is done. He has to acquire the three gifts, which, in a certain way, are a reflection of himself. If you look at traditional stories where there's an apple is usually associated with the heart. A golden apple associated with a heart of gold, meaning an extremely virtuous, extremely wise man. He would have to achieve this on a spiritual level, becoming a man of gold. But he would also have to acquire the dog of the fairy king, which was an extremely loyal animal, faithful to its owner, extremely clever, meaning he would have to master this emotional aspect, which was represented by the dog through obedience to its master, enthusiasm, and dedication to serving its master. And he would also have to acquire the perfect steed, which was the iron steed. If you notice in the tales, it's very common for the steed to be an extension of the hero himself, as if it were a part of his body. For those familiar with the story of the centaur, for example, the horse and the man become a single being in size. The mastery he has over his steed. It is his physical body that he masters with his instincts, with his drives, and he masters it in such a way that a centaur like Chiron. He learned from his human side and also from his animal side, because nature has much to teach us in all its aspects. So, what she offers him is an incredibly difficult conquest, almost impossible, which was the conquest of oneself. And he who cannot, realizing the evil in her, which he hadn't seen until then due to his naivety, and it was precisely this naivety that prevented him from being king. When he realizes that she represented evil, he manages to isolate her, to confine her to a certain place, so that she wouldn't continue spreading her wicked deeds. In other words, he cannot, at first, due to naivety, overcome the evil within himself, but he manages to isolate it, to contain it, to keep it immobilized until he completes his heroic quest. So, once again, what we've been discussing. When we spoke in our first meeting, there's a bit of what alchemy called sympathetic magic. What's happening outside is also happening within him. At the same time, in both worlds, meaning the stepmother is both outside and inside as well. And he sets off on the heroic journey then. He doesn't even know where to start. He has no idea where these things were. So, he seeks out a Druid who was considered the wisest Druid in that region. And the Druid says that he consults his spirits, advisors, and his own knowledge. And he says, "It's beyond my reach to find the solution you need. It will be where you can find the way out." And he will point out a formula to him. Look closely, the Druid, if we were to interpret right, he was a wise man. It's not that he didn't know, but it's because the wisdom of conquering oneself can only be pointed out, but it cannot be given. He points the way for the prince to conquer himself and, thus, be worthy. No one can walk the path for us. At most, it can point the way. Then, he points to a little horse that had stopped in front of his house, a very furry, insignificant little horse, a horse of no importance, considering that he, a prince, had access to horses of noble blood. Much better than that one. But you will ride this horse, for it will take you to your destiny. To a place, a mountain, where there is a bird with a human head. That this magical bird will be able to point you in the right direction. Now you take this precious stone, and if you ask questions and it doesn't answer you, you offer the precious stone. And by offering this precious stone, he will be compelled to accept it and answer whatever you ask. And so the prince goes. He rides on, right, his furry little horse. On the small and insignificant horse, they arrive at the rock, the place where the bird with a human head lived. And he asks questions, but the bird evidently doesn't respond. He offers the precious stone, and then the bird finds itself obliged to answer. And he says, "Remove this stone you're standing on. You will find a chalice and an iron ball. Take both, throw this iron ball in front of your little horse. It will start talking to you, follow that ball, and guide you through every step of the way." And he does just that. He removes the chalice and the iron ball, places the stone in its place, and does exactly as recommended. He throws the iron ball, it starts rolling, and the horse begins to walk with its rider, heading in the direction of the iron ball. Look how interesting, because it's very difficult for us not to make associations. On one hand, you will see that there exists, within the Egyptian tradition, the Ba, which was considered the higher mind of man, the pure mind. This pure mind, the pure one, was exactly a bird with a human head. In other words, it's very difficult. Of course, there isn't a transfer of information from one side to the other. It's not impossible, but it's difficult for there to be. But there exists a similar model, the same archetype, that humans can grasp anywhere in time or space. In other words, there is something greater within us, a higher voice. It's like our winged mind. The head of a man, but with wings. In other words, a mind that soars higher and has a purer vision, guiding him to find the things that are necessary. Your animal self needs a guide to lead it to the center of the world, to the center of itself. And this guide will be this iron ball. This iron ball, when released, rolls to the most central region, which lies within a lake, which is precisely the dwelling, the realm of the fairies, that he intended to find. What is the sacred realm? Not just outside, remember, but also within. This rolling ball will lead him to the center of himself. He must have the necessary humility to let his little horse guide him. In other words, at this moment, if he uses his emotions, his fears, his desires, or a lower, trivial mind, all of this will lead him astray from the path. The educated instincts of his little horse are capable of following the course of the forces of life, finding the course of the forces of life. And if he is able to listen, he can reach his other self. It's his point, his long-sought target, which is the fairy kingdom. And he does it. So he throws the iron ball, it starts rolling, and his little horse follows it, searching for the lowest and most central region. In other words, searching for himself, his center. And he goes after it. The horse follows. With him riding, until he reaches a certain region, he dives into a lake. And the horse pauses for a moment. He asks them to prepare themselves, because they would continue from there. And they dive into the water, as if they were in another environment, perfectly breathable, just another setting with a slightly different luminosity. But a world like any other, underwater. He keeps going until, at a certain moment, the ball passes through a region where there were 3 serpents. Fierce, terrifying, with their teeth bared, and the little horse stops and says to him, "Look, take. Inside my ear, you will find 2 things hidden, a basket and a vial with a certain magical medicine. The tonic, the balm, heals everything. Keep these 2 things with you." Look how interesting this is, because in a certain way, it's his physical body that speaks. It's his instincts, his reflexes, which at that moment are guided by the higher mind, which is the bird with a human head. They are searching for the point where he can transcend and become a true human being, worthy of ruling over himself. But he has accumulated within himself, in his ears, which indicates things he has heard throughout his life. Outside, the teachings received, the traditions passed down, these are jewels that will protect them from what is to come. From there onward, in other words, what is stored in his ears is the wisdom accumulated by the body, in the memory, in the brain, throughout his entire life. And this accumulated wisdom is now the medicine he needs. And then, when they approach the serpents, the little horse says, "Look, the basket you took from my ear. Open it, there are 3 chunks of meat. You have to throw a piece into the mouth of each serpent, and they will let us pass. You have to be precise, you can't miss. A piece of meat in the mouth of each serpent, and they will let us pass." And he does exactly that, and with precise aim he hits the pieces of meat into the mouth of each serpent, and they allow passage, and they continue on their way. It's impossible for us not to make associations. For those who know a bit about the story of Osiris in Egypt, there comes a certain moment when he heads to the Ament, and the crocodile Sobek asks him for his leg. And he gives his leg to Sobek, who devours it, and continues towards the Ament, hopping on one leg. In other words, when we want to purify ourselves, some of the things we consider at that moment. Our flesh, our leg, which are our flaws, our vices, our inertia. They will have to be offered as a sacrifice. It's the sacrifice. Very similar to something we see in an Indian tradition in a wonderful book called the Bhagavad Gita. There comes a certain moment when we have to cut away our flaws. And they're so attached to us, it's as if it were a mutilation. Cutting away a vanity, a pride, a weakness, is like you're mutilating yourself, cutting off an arm. It hurts. But it's the necessary sacrifice for those who want to keep climbing. In other words, the meat he throws is a part of his own flesh. It's something that is kept and set apart. It is necessary for it to be sacrificed at that moment. He leaves things behind as if you were climbing a mountain. And here is all the load that's in your backpack. You can't take it anymore. The weight is too heavy, and something has to be sacrificed there so that you can keep climbing. Having made this sacrifice, the little horse continues with him on its back until they arrive at the edge of a cliff where there was a mountain on fire. A mountain on the other side engulfed in flames. And the horse says, "Look, now it's necessary for us to cross this mountain. Hold on tight to the saddle and don't let go under any circumstances." And the horse flies over that mountain and reaches the other side. On the other side, he asks the prince, "Are you still alive and riding on me?" He says, "Yes, I am, but quite singed." Then the horse says, "Take that little vial I gave you," which is the healing balm. It cures everything. Take a little, half of this balm, and apply it on yourself. He does this, and the healing happens immediately. His skin becomes completely whole, just as it was before. And the two continue walking. It's interesting because it's as if he went through a baptism there. Notice, he was baptized by water and by fire, that is, the baptism of water and the baptism of the Spirit. And he goes beyond the two. And all the wisdom he has gathered, symbolized by this ointment, is capable of healing the wounds that were created along this journey. His wisdom justifies everything that has been experienced, and it makes him close his wounds. And they keep walking until they reach the gate of the fairy city. That's the hardest test. The little horse comes up to him and says, "Look, you see there's a portal over there. If you get off me and go through there, they will stop you, maybe even kill you. You won't get in. You need to take out from inside my other ear a dagger that is there." In other words, something that also encapsulated wisdom was inside the horse's ear. You take out a dagger and sacrifice me. By sacrificing me, you have to take my skin and place it over your shoulders. And everyone will let you pass through there. Then you can come and go freely. I only ask that when you enter, you come back and apply the rest of the balm on my body. The prince is completely distraught at this moment because the horse was responsible for everything he had achieved up to that point. He says, "No, I would rather die with you. I will not commit such sacrilege. I will not commit such a crime." And it's very beautiful because the little horse comes to him and says, "If you don't do this, we will both die. Learn to listen to me. Do what I am asking of you." This reminds me a lot of a passage from that book I just mentioned to you. The Hindu Bhagavad Gita, where the prince who had to fight an army is taken by Krishna to the middle of the two armies to blow his trumpet and start the war. And the prince, in this case, who was Arjuna, begins to weep for the relatives he did not want to kill. Kill. To kill in these traditions, from a mythical, symbolic perspective, is not to eliminate. You won't find a tradition that believes death is elimination. Death is transmutation. It is rebirth on another level, in another place, to continue walking under different conditions. We, modern Westerners, for us, death is the end. That doesn't exist in the tales. It was necessary for him to kill a level of consciousness to be reborn into another. It is in dying that one is born to eternal life. So, he ends up being convinced by the little horse. He kills, removes its skin with great sorrow, tears streaming down. He spends an entire night crying there beside that horse. The next day, when it's time to leave, he places the skin over his shoulders, just like Hercules did with the Nemean lion. And that strength and energy from the skin become ingrained in him. And he goes there and crosses that gate. When he crosses, he remembers the horse's request and returns. Upon returning, he takes the rest of the ointment and applies it over the scalp body of the horse. And automatically a transmutation occurs. He sees that the remains of that dead horse become a beautiful prince. This beautiful prince says he was the brother of the king of the fairy city, who had been imprisoned by the Druid, and that only he could set him free. When he became the steed of a human prince, he could be freed. And then, at that moment, he was very grateful, because everyone in the city of the fairies were waiting for him, and he had set him free. He enters, is warmly welcomed, and stays there for almost a year, which was the time he had to achieve his goals, return, and give an answer to his stepmother. The inhabitants of that kingdom ask him to stay with them until almost the end of the deadline. And there, quite easily, he is presented with the things that were missing, which were the golden apples, the 3 golden apples, which he had already conquered within himself. Therefore, what was being given externally was merely a trophy, a recognition. The dog, the hunting dog, which he needed to conquer, he had also learned to hunt within himself, the best. Therefore, he deserved it, it was a recognition. And the thoroughbred horse, which could transport him, he had also already mastered the control of his steed. And now it becomes very much. It's not a small, furry pony. Now it's a thoroughbred. This reminds me a bit of the myth of King Arthur, when the Lady of the Lake retrieves Excalibur from the waters. In truth, he had already achieved Excalibur within himself. And that is an external recognition. It's a symbol of what he has already accomplished. By conquering, mastering, and uniting all the kingdoms of Britain. So, the prince also receives these 3 gifts as a recognition of the inner work he had already accomplished. He could not take it if he were not worthy of it. Now, notice that he had already mastered the control of his steed, the mastery of his emotions to face all the dangers along the way, without losing confidence, and now he had transformed. He himself, because the prince of the fairy kingdom is nothing more than an alter ego. It is himself on a spiritual plane. So, the 3 worlds, spiritual, emotional, and physical, unite in harmony. And now he is a man prepared to reign, because he knows how to deal with the shadows within. Therefore, he can act when they arise externally. Otherwise, he would be defenseless, leaving the kingdom equally defenseless. Now, he reigns over himself. Therefore, he is a ruler in potential. No one can govern others if they do not govern themselves. Then, after that, he continues. He returns home, and when he arrives, he finds the queen in the place where he had left her, up in the high tower. She, when she was already very close, because the time she had to wait was a year and a day, the deadline. It was close to running out, and she was hopeful that he wouldn't return. When she sees him appearing on the horse and bringing the dog on the horizon, she despairs and throws herself from the high tower. In other words, without him doing anything, by having conquered and subdued the evil within, he conquers and subdues the evil outside. There was no need to do anything. The victory had already been won. He approaches. Then he narrates everything to his father, who is horrified by what his wife had done. He becomes an excellent king and reigns over those lands for many years. He buries the golden apples, which is interesting. By burying these golden apples, they reproduce, they multiply. In other words, this golden heart that he has conquered becomes an example and makes the land fertile to produce other golden hearts. The apples are fruitful, just like his reign, and everyone lives happily ever after. Well, some of the observations that Zimmer makes, in addition to those I've already shared throughout the story, are very interesting. He will say that the prince ignores the forces of evil, and that's why he is fragile. He needed to know that every human being, as Pagan would say, is a mix of one and the other, a blend of light and shadow. And he had to learn to deal with his own shadows, because by subjugating them, he would have power over the shadows outside. Therefore, he becomes a true redeemer. A redeemer of the inexperienced naivety and insecurity of his people. It allows each person to learn to do the same. But first, he needed to conquer himself. And, for that, he hastens the trials. The stepmother, then, will make him embark on this somewhat crazy adventure, for which he does not feel prepared. And he will embark on this journey. You see, he is endorsed by all the elements. He is challenged and endorsed by all the elements. In other words, he faces the water, he faces the fire, and Zimmer says that, in a certain way, the water condenses along with the earth, which are the denser elements, while the fire condenses along with the air, which are the more subtle elements. By conquering the water and the fire, he integrates them within himself. Not just them, but also the air and the earth. In other words, he masters the four elements. He is master of himself. This is the baptism in the waters, the baptism in the fire. The baptism, twice born, as they say in Egypt, is the one who, twice, conquered the elements of earth and heaven. And he unified them within himself. He achieved, just like his father and mother, that harmony through opposition. His own name is a combination of his father's name and his mother's name, which already foresees his saga of harmonizing all the factors of the earth. Continuing, he will say that the man who cannot confront these shadows, know them, master them, establish control over them, by naively throwing himself into the shadows, will result in two quite harmful consequences, which would be the disbelief in the possibility of a human being to be a human being. Or worse, the impotence of feeling completely unable to launch himself against these forces. In other words, either he believes they are unbeatable, or he doubts that he is capable of overcoming them. And these two things are nothing more than a psychological symptom of a man defeated by evil. Instead of finding the path to overcome it, he either becomes disenchanted and believes adversity to be unbeatable, or he develops a complex where he begins to doubt himself as a being capable of overcoming these shadows. And a prince could not be like that, and realize that we were all destined to reign over the four elements, to reign over ourselves, to be masters of our own kingdom, to be able to maintain control over the shadows. Well, continuing. It's very interesting as well. If you see, there's another book I've mentioned to you before, which is The Light on the Path. The humility that was asked of him, not only to know how to subdue these elements, but also to understand what each of them had to teach him. If it weren't for the voice of raw nature, represented by the iron ball, by his simple little horse, if he didn't know how to learn from these things, he wouldn't have the tools to overcome his trials. In The Light on the Path, there is a phrase where each element is questioned. Ask the earth the secrets it has kept for you. In other words, he doesn't simply eliminate or subdue the forces. He learns from them and listens to the voice of these forces. Just like Centaur Chiron, who listened to his horse part and his human part. Just like Odin, the great god of Norse mythology, was great because he listened to everything everyone had to teach him. He integrates all these things. He subdues, but does not eliminate. It's a bit like the alchemist's work in black. Dive into the shadows, recognize everything that lives there. Subdues, does not eliminate. The work in white is nothing more than a taming of our shadows. the overcoming of being a plaything in their hands, to be able to master them. A year, that history. That is set, the time given to him represents a complete life cycle. You will see this in various traditions. In the Bardo Thodol, it's 49 days. In other traditions, it's 40 days. It's 10,000 years in other traditions. It's a representation of a life cycle. Life is basically that. Recognize the shadows, master them, learn to deal with them, ascend and illuminate. It would be the work in iron, the work in white, and the work in red of the medieval alchemists. He reaches the work in red. He indeed becomes a magnificent king, who now has the possibility of using all his tools to direct the earth towards its mystical marriage with heaven in order to bring about its harmony. And finally, Zimmer will say that the only way to deal with external evil is, first and foremost, by recognizing and subduing the internal, which is a truth. He will also say that it is very common in various traditions for the heroic deed, the action of some hero, to be aimed at freeing a divine being. And deep down, this is what happens with us. Our heroic journey, our adventure, is meant to free a divine being that lives imprisoned within us. Until we learn to find the keys to this cell, we will not free that divine being that lives within us. Therefore, it's quite a representative story. I draw your attention because a common oral message wouldn't need so many elements. That's what Zimmer himself said when we talked about the babushkas, the sheer number of elements and details. Do you realize that there is a way of the cross there, showing our own journey towards reigning over ourselves and being able to govern our lives in the direction of fulfilling our role? To produce golden apples, to cultivate pure hearts, to create a worthy work in the world, to develop within us the power to be fully human. And, through our example, inspire this in others. This is a true heroic journey, which frees the divine being that lives within us. We'll stop here for today, and I hope you're following along with the reading and that we can have a lot of fun with it. And also to learn. Thank you, Max.